Hi, my name is Gene Arnold from TipGo Jaspersoft, and today we'll be discussing external LDAP authentication and how it works with JasperReports Server. To start this tutorial, let's discuss what's supposed to happen when JasperReports Server is connected to an LDAP server. A user who has their credentials stored in an LDAP server tries to log in to JasperReports Server. The user's username and password are sent to the connected LDAP server for evaluation. If the user's username and password both match what is in the LDAP server, then a copy of the user and their roles are created inside of JasperReports Server. I'll discuss the copying of users and user information into JasperReports Server later in the tutorial. Once the above process is complete, the user is granted access into JasperReports Server. In the upcoming example, I have my users stored in an Active Directory LDAP server. You may choose to use a different LDAP server, but the principles discussed within this tutorial should be universal. As you can see here, all user, role, and organization information is saved inside the LDAP server. JasperReports Server will be configured to speak to this LDAP server, allowing for external LDAP authentication. At this point, it's time to switch over to JasperReports Server and see this happen live. In the first part of our example, let's log into JasperReports Server as one of our users stored inside of the LDAP server. I'm going to use a user that's part of the West organization named S-Wood. I'll apply this user's username and password inside of JasperReports Server's login screen. Notice in the upper right-hand corner the username S-Wood, as you would expect. The way I have my JasperReports Server set up is that users with the role Jasper Admin are granted admin access within their organization. This is why you see admin functionality available for the S-Wood user. Let's head over to the user section of JasperReports Server and see the roles assigned to this user. From within the Manage User section of the system, you can see that S-Wood has the following roles assigned. Role_administrator. This role was assigned because the role Jasper Admin is assigned to the account from within the LDAP server. My JasperReports server has been set up to map these roles together. Again, more on this later. Role_user. This is a default role assigned to all accounts created inside of JasperReports Server. Regardless of how the user is created inside of JasperReports Server, this role is always assigned. Any number of default roles can be automatically assigned to an account when it's created. Notice that S-Wood is an external user, noted by the This user is defined externally checkbox, and is the only external user. Let's add another user to this organization. I'm now going to log into JasperReports Server with the user account B. Wang, who is also part of the West organization. Earlier I mentioned that users are synced into JasperReports Server, and this will be an example of another user being synced into JasperReports Server just like user S-Wood. You can see that I'm logged in as B. Wang, but notice that I do not have any admin access. This is because the B. Wang user does not have the Jasper admin role assigned to it inside of the LDAP server. Being this the case, the role_administrator role was not mapped over to this user. I'm now going to log in as another user, S. Anderson, who is part of the Central region. Then I'll log in as super user so you can see the effects of users logging in from different organizations and how their roles have been assigned. So after logging in as S. Anderson from the Central region, you'll see that underneath the organization section, there's a new organization called Central. This organization has two users in it, the S. Anderson user and the Jasper admin default user that's created when any new organization is created. When I click on S. Anderson, notice the roles. He has role_team_B. This role was pulled into Jaspersoft because it's assigned to him in the LDAP server. And of course, the default role_user. If we move over to the West organization and click on the B. Wang user, her roles are slightly different. She's part of the role_team_A group, and again the default role_user. These have been brought in from the LDAP server. Well, the role_A was brought in from the LDAP server. Just remember, role_user is a default role, and you can attach as many default roles to users as you'd like. And finally, let's just click on SWood one last time. Notice this user does not have any of the team roles. He has an administrator role, role_administrator, that was mapped in, and he has the default role of role_user. Now that you've seen LDAP authentication in action, let's learn how this all works and what's required on your end to set it up. Within your installer directory of JasperReports Server, you'll find a folder called external auth-sample-config. The system ships with various authentication setup samples to make implementing external authentication easier. For our needs, we'll be choosing the sample-application context-external auth-ldap-mt.xml file. This file needs to be copied to where JasperReports Server is installed. I'll be right-clicking on this file and choosing Copy. With the file copied, it will need to be placed in the following directory. The location of your web application server. I'm using Tomcat. Within that server, you'll need to move to the web apps directory, then the directory called JasperServer-Pro. Within that directory, you'll be looking to move to the web-inf folder. After the file is copied into this directory, it will need to be renamed to application context-external auth-db-mt-xml. Now that the file is copied to the proper location and renamed, open it up in your favorite text editor. There really are only a few sections within the file that need to be updated to have LDAP authentication work with JasperReports Server. The first section to configure should be around line number 112 in a bean labeled LDAP context source. This section of the file will handle connecting JasperReports Server to your LDAP server. You will need to enter in the location of your LDAP server first. Here's an important tip for you. Make sure that you type in LDAP in lowercase. If this is typed in with uppercase, JasperReports Server will not be able to locate your LDAP server. Follow this entry with a distinguished name of a user that JasperReports Server can log into your LDAP server and query for information. Finally, the password associated with this above user. Next, we need to configure the system to look for users in the LDAP server when we try to log in to JasperReports Server. After we find a user, we also need to configure how JasperReports Server will search for this user's roles. This process starts right around line number 74 within a bean called LDAP Authentication Provider. There are actually two ways to search for users. One method is called User DN Pattern, and this will use a distinguished name to find a user in your LDAP server. The other is called User Search. With this method, you offer information about the user, and JasperReports Server will search your LDAP server for that specific user. Though in my example, I'm using the User Search method, you actually can use both to find users within your LDAP server. This is documented in the Authentication Cookbook. I would advise you to check this out if you'd like to learn more about this topic. Since I chose to use the User Search option to find my users in the LDAP server, I'll need to configure this option. You can find a bean labeled User Search located near line number 94. The property we'll focus in on here is around line number 100 in my system. It contains the query that will be used to find the user in the LDAP server. Something very important to note here. The queries you enter here are normal LDAP queries and can be tested in external LDAP tools. Let's quickly break down the query I'm using to find my users. The user must be based off of a user object class. The user must have a CN that is equal to the name passed into JasperReports Server's login screen. Finally, the user must be part of a specific role to be allowed access. I like adding in this little extra role option so you can create a method of only allowing certain users to access JasperReports Server. Once our user is discovered, we have to find any roles that are attached to them. This is also found in the bean labeled LDAP Authentication Provider located near line number 74. The properties that must be configured here are as followed: where the roles can be found in the LDAP server, the value used to find the role in the location provided above, then finally the location in the actual role to search and see if the user is part of this role. There are two sections left to configure within this file. If multi-tenancy is being used, you need to set up the system to know where to find the information regarding what tenant the user is part of. You can set this up in a bean labeled LDAP External Tenant Processor near line number 147. For my system, you can see that line number 160 examines the OU value of the user's name. This value is then used to either create a new organization if one does not exist, or use this name to identify the organization and place the user inside it inside of JasperReports Server. You can also assign a root organization that all new organizations are placed in. Remember that the West and Central organizations in my example were both placed inside of organization_1. You can also set up the system to create new root level organizations rather than having them nest inside of a single organization. This is completely up to you and what your needs are. Lastly, in this bean, you configure any default users that you want to create upon creating a new domain. The information starting at line number 169 of my system will create a new user using the default system settings. These settings will create the Jasper admin user that you see in all new tenants. It's also very important to set the user's roles, and that is done in the same section. As you can see, this new user will have the following roles assigned to them: role_administrator and role_user. You can add as many roles as you like here, and you can also create as many default users as you like as well. Our final section to discuss handles role mapping. You can find this near line number 197 in a bean labeled MT External User Setup Processor. Default roles can be assigned to users, as you saw earlier in this tutorial. This is handled near line number 204 inside a property labeled Default Internal Roles. The out-of-the-box setup assigns role_user to any newly created user. You can assign any number of roles to this list. Next up comes Organization Role Map, configured near line number 210. Each key value pair is stored inside of an entry. My system is set up to look for role_JasperAdmin that would come in from the LDAP server. This role is mapped to role_administrator, which is an internal JasperReports Server role. This is exactly how the user S. Wood became an administrator within the West organization when created. The last entry to discuss in my configuration is permitted roles regex near line number 225. What you're doing in this section is setting up regular expressions that act as gates to allow roles to be entered into the system. Each role assigned to a user inside the LDAP server will be tested against the expressions in this property. If the role matches one of these expressions, it is then allowed inside of JasperReports Server. My file is simply using exact matching of the role names, but more elaborate expressions can be used here. Now, this by no means is an exhausted list of options that can be configured inside of this file, though it will get you started and really was the purpose of this tutorial. To test out your LDAP authentication, you will need to restart your Java application server. I'm using Tomcat and have the system configured so I can reload my web apps one at a time. Your system may be set up differently, and will require you to restart the server completely. So now what? Do some custom work, theme JasperReports Server, start connecting to your databases, then create some amazing content. If you'd like to learn more about authentication with JasperReports Server, please go to our documentation section inside of the Jaspersoft community. You can download a book called TIBCO JasperReports Server Authentication Cookbook. This document covers various external authentication processes and certainly the LDAP authentication process that we discussed today within this tutorial. Once again, my name's Gene Arnold from TIBCO Jaspersoft. I hope you learned something from this video, and thanks for tuning in.